Hello, I'm Brian Fagan, and I'm an archaeologist, and my specialty is the prehistory of humankind, the subject of this course. This first lecture is kind of an introduction to this extraordinarily large subject. And I'm going to begin by stressing that this course is a narrative story of world prehistory, a human history before written records, based on scientific evidence. Once I've made this point, I'm going to summarize the organization of the course into 6 parts, beginning with human origins and the archaic world, then describing the emergence and spread of modern humans, the beginnings of food production, that's agriculture and animal domestication, and then the emergence of the world's first pre-industrial civilizations. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the pervasive issues of the course, which include emerging human biological and cultural diversity, as well as our similarities, the importance of climate and environmental change, and the importance of considering prehistory as a chronicle not just of archaeological sites, but of people living their daily lives. And also, I'm going to stress the importance of the intangible beliefs of the ancients to the understanding of human prehistory and ultimately ourselves. The prehistory of humankind describes over 2.5 million years of the human past. It actually begins 6 million years ago, with our origins among the apes in eastern Africa. And from here, we cover an enormous span of time, up to the appearance of literate urban civilization in southwestern Asia some 5,000 years ago. And I'll also describe the early civilizations which developed in Asia and the Americas, ending our story with the Spanish conquest of Mexico and Peru. This course is a story. It's a narrative of prehistoric times, of thousands upon thousands of years of pre-literate history. A story that could only be told fairly recently, because we simply didn't know enough about the archaeological record in various parts of the world. The story is still incomplete, but at least we can give you a preliminary account. This is a course about world prehistory, the study of the human past on a global level, not just from the perspective of Europe or the Americas or even Asia, but from a global perspective. We give, as much as possible, equal time to all parts of the world in this course. We couldn't do this a couple of generations ago. It was only made possible by the development of a remarkable dating technique, radiocarbon dating, after World War II. Now, the dating methods used in this course are described in an appendix to the course guide. If you want to know more about them, you should consult the guide. Another phenomenon has also added to our knowledge of human prehistory in recent years. That is a massive explosion of the number of archaeologists in the world. Before World War II, there were probably 100 to 150 archaeologists scattered around the world. Now, there are thousands. The result has been a great expansion of archaeological research into many hitherto unexplored parts of the world since the 1950s. Many portions of Eurasia, parts of China, Southeast Asia, tropical Africa. We now know infinitely more about how humans populated the world, how they came into being, and how they developed their extraordinary cultural and biological diversity, much more than we did even a generation ago. How do we tell this story? What evidence do we use for it? The word prehistory, which to some people is a rather loaded expression, means the history of humankind before the advent of written records. We do not have archives, we don't have diaries of individuals, we do not have political files and speeches to work with. We only have evidence from other sources. Prehistory, history before written records. The term was invented by a French archaeologist back at the beginning of the 19th century. But it's stuck in the literature and is used to this day. It's a convenient label. The prehistory of humankind, the study of people before writing, is based on innumerable academic disciplines. During the course of the next 36 lectures, we will draw on archaeology, oral history, that's history transmitted from one generation to the next by word of mouth. We will draw even on the incomplete written records of the early civilizations. We will draw on biology, zoology, and innumerable other scientific disciplines and studies. I want to stress that here we are not concerned with myth and legend or biblical wit. This is a narrative based on science and on scientific research, much of it conducted in the last 30 years, and much of it cutting edge, very new. This is something which is rapidly turning our knowledge of the remote human past into something vibrant and living. We're beginning to find that people have behaved in remarkably diverse ways over the last 2.5 million years. This, then, is a human prehistory constructed from scientific research. It is not an account of the past based on fantasy, unsubstantiated legend, or science fiction, none of which have any place in our story. I'm not going to tell you tales of the lost continent of Atlantis, or of ancient space people colonizing Earth thousands of years ago. These are simplistic formulations by people who want a good story and don't necessarily have the patience to contemplate the painstaking, slow-moving pace of science. This is a story based on science. But this science has its own distinctive perspective. We Westerners tend to think of the past in linear terms. Why? Because our watches chronicle the passing of time as our calendars do. We have a linear view of human history. And as a result, Western science has constructed a linear view of the last 2.5 million years of human prehistory. It's constructed from a jigsaw puzzle of excavations, archaeological surveys, and scientific dating methods. This linear chronology, and this course, for much of it, is organized in a linear fashion, is the framework for our story. Every episode here begins at the beginning and goes through time, from the earlier to the later. This linear framework is very different from the cyclical view of time, which many ancient and traditional societies possess or possessed. These cyclical versions are often driven by different verities. The endless passage of the seasons. Spring, the period of growth and rebirth. The summer, when the plants grow to maturity. The fall, the rich time of harvest. And then winter, the quiescent time, the time of death. And this endless cyclical passage of time, of the seasons, is intimately associated in the minds of many societies with the age-old cycles of humanity: birth, youth, adulthood, old age, and death. The endless cycle of humanity. The expectation that life will continue after you have gone through the cycle of life, and that your successors and descendants will enjoy the same life as you have and was enjoyed by your ancestors. Many traditional societies find a linear view of the past somewhat threatening. This course is offered with respect as a scientific account of what happened in human prehistory and why. The cyclical views of the past offer perspectives into the world views of individual societies, and occasionally in the later part of the course we will refer to these cyclical visions. But our course is based on a linear perspective and has a perspective internationally far larger than the relatively narrow cyclical world views of traditional societies. The prehistory of humankind is divided into 6 parts. They coincide with major developments in prehistoric times. Part 1, Beginnings, describes the archaic world of the first humans. Here we discuss the controversial subject of human origins in East Africa, the fossil evidence for human evolution, the archaeological sites, and the theories which surround the exact nature of early human behavior. Were we more ape-like? Were we more human? The debate continues to rage. Then we discuss the evolution of later, more advanced humans and their simple hunter-gatherer societies, chronicling their spread over the Old World, but not over the Americas, after 2 million years ago. Part 1 ends with the archaic forms of Homo sapiens, the immediate predecessors of modern humans. The Europeans, we stress particularly here the European Neanderthals of 100,000 to 30,000 years ago. Part 2, again 6 lectures, covers modern humans. It begins with the controversies surrounding the origins of Homo sapiens sapiens, modern humans, ourselves. As you will see, we think that they originated in tropical Africa. And we then trace their spread across the Old World and into the Americas during the late Ice Age, between about 100,000 and 15,000 years ago. This was a period of tremendous innovations in human society, such as new, more sophisticated technologies, the first open water navigation, and the first efflorescence of full human cognitive abilities, the ability to reason, to plan, to conceptualize theoretical ideas and ritual concepts. It's the first appearance of art, of a rich symbolic life as part of human experience. In Part 3, the pace of cultural evolution is rapidly accelerating. In Farmers and Herders, in 6 lectures, which begin immediately after the end of the Great Ice Age, we start seeing people beginning to cultivate the soil and domesticate animals. Somewhere around 10,000 BC in Southwest Asia, when people suddenly start cultivating wild grasses. Why did they do this? We examine some of the theories which seek to explain this abrupt changeover. And then we visit some early farming sites in the region, especially the ancient town of Jericho, one of the earliest farming settlements in the world. We note how agriculture and animal domestication also took hold in other regions independent of Southwest Asia. Among them, the domestication of rice in Southern Asia and cereals and rice in East Asia. We analyze these developments and their momentous consequences for the later course of history, and then study the first appearance of cultivation in the Americas, somewhere around 5,000 BC. We should not forget, at the time of the Spanish conquest of Mexico and Peru in the early 16th century, the Native Americans were probably the most skilled farmers in the world, who domesticated an extraordinary range of plants, among them tobacco, potatoes, and tomatoes, which today are staples of world civilization. We tell the story of the spread of farming into Europe, perhaps, and this is pure speculation, in part the result of a great natural cataclysm, when the Black Sea, instead of being a freshwater lake, became the Black Sea itself, a brackish body of water, flooding hundreds of square miles of prime farming land. And we also survey the first colonization of the offshore islands of the Pacific, Micronesia, Polynesia, the last land masses to be colonized by prehistoric humans. Parts 4 to 6 of the course examine the earliest civilizations in the world. Part 4 covers the Eastern Mediterranean. We begin by examining the major theories which account for the appearance of civilization, and then we trace the early history of urban civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the land of the pharaohs and the land between the rivers. We also describe the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations of Crete and Greece, and the complex Eastern Mediterranean world of the 2nd millennium BC, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and the other powers which competed in Southwest Asia for control of trade routes and powerful sources of major raw materials. Part 5 takes us into archaeologically less well-known parts of the world. We examine Africa and Asia. And here we look closely at one of the major themes of the course, which can be summed up in one word: interconnectedness. Few human societies have ever lived independent of others. Few are self-sufficient. Many of them enjoyed constant contacts with neighbors who gave them commodities and foods and luxuries they might not otherwise have had. And this constant interconnectedness accelerated after the development of agriculture and even further with the arrival of civilization. And in this particular part of the course, we begin our story in South Asia, where civilization began along the Indus River somewhat later than it did in Mesopotamia, but by 2000 BC, people in big cities were trading regularly with Mesopotamia, with Bahrain, with the Persian Gulf. And this network of interconnectedness, this web of interconnectedness, spread rapidly until, in the Christian era, it encompassed not only the Indian Ocean, but also the East African coast and China. There was this huge international trade involving downwind sailing ships, camels, and camels themselves were domesticated quite early on, but the issue isn't the camel, it's the saddle upon which the rider rides or carries cargo, because the essence of the camel is to be able to cross deserts. So you had the ship of the desert and the ship of the ocean. And this created this huge interconnected world from which sprang, among other things, the spectacular civilizations of the Khmer of Southeast Asia. Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, these huge ceremonial centers which were built to gratify the grandiloquent desires of powerful Khmer monarchs. Some of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. And in the final part of the course, we go to China, and then from there into the very final part, into the Americas. The history of Chinese civilization unfolds from its origins in increasingly complex agricultural societies before 3000 BC, with the emergence of the legendary dynasties of North China, Xia, Shang, and Zhao. And we unfold the story and tell it right up to the unification of China by the first emperor in 221 BC, and end with the flamboyant Han dynasty of China, which traded, among other things, with Africa. This world of interconnectedness in Part 6 gives way to an entirely different continent. And the Ancient Americans tells the story of sophisticated Native American societies which arose over the last 3,500 years. We begin with the Pueblo cultures of the North American Southwest and the aggressive chiefdoms which developed in the South and Southwest, often called the Mississippian culture. This spectacular culture was based on profound spiritual beliefs which we know a surprising amount about thanks to anthropological research. 2 lectures then describe the lowland and highland Mesoamerican civilizations. I should mention that Mesoamerica is that part of Central America where civilizations developed. We begin with the mysterious, little-known Olmec, then explore ancient Maya civilization in the lowlands. And then on the highlands, we describe the rise of Zapotec civilization, the great city-state of Teotihuacan, and then the militaristic Aztec civilization overthrown by the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortes in 1521. Finally, 2 lectures explore the development of civilization in the Andes, along the arid Peruvian coast and high in the mountains, including the gold-decked Moche State, Tiwanaku, and Chimo, and finally the astounding Inca Empire, destroyed by Spaniard Francisco Pizarro in AD 1532. A flamboyant, long-stretching narrative, complex, but alas, the one thing about it is that it is lamentably incomplete. I've tried to overcome the limitations of the evidence by designing a course which is a flowing narrative, which moves forward at the expense of technical detail, to linger on overarching themes and issues, over controversies rather than the minutiae of individual, often obscure sites and academic theories. This is a field peopled by specialists, but the issues are enormous, and they are very fundamental to our understanding of ourselves. There is no one overarching theme to the prehistory of humankind. The subject is simply too diffuse to allow such a luxury. But there are some pervasive issues which help us shape this narrative. A narrative built not on the deeds of individuals, the pronouncements of politicians and kings, or the rivalry of nations, but on millions of people living their lives, interacting with each other, with neighbors, with husbands, with wives, with children, with grandparents, with ancestors, with descendants. And from this, we have created a chronicle. Human prehistory is a chronicle of increasing biological and cultural diversity, which is reflected in our own biologically and culturally diverse world. And I think it's very important that all of us understand the deep roots of this biological and cultural diversity. But there's another very pervasive theme in this course too. We humans may be diverse, but are also remarkably similar in the ways in which we behave and in the solutions we develop for survival. For example, this is why many of the early civilizations developed such institutions as divine kingship, spectacular public ceremonies, and so on. because this is a logical solution, if you do not have fossil fuels, to the problem of creating and maintaining a large state. The late Stephen Jay Gould, the biological anthropologist, once remarked that we are all products of the same African twig. He is correct, before current evidence suggests that modern humans originated in Africa. And I hope this narrative reflects the fact that we are all products of the same African twig on this huge, bushy tree of human evolution. Another very pervasive theme of this course is the ever-changing background of environmental and climatic shifts. In considerable but not total part, the ways in which people have adjusted to climate change have shaped our prehistory. Climate change is millennial. None of us noticed that, the fluctuations of the Ice Age. But it also can operate in drought cycles which last several generations, or in an El Nino which may last a year. And increasingly now, with a greater sophistication of paleoclimatology, we are able to look at these climate changes and assess what effect they had on human society. Often they were like a pebble dropped in the pond, where the consequences politically and socially can be markedly noticeable in the archaeological record. Human prehistory is inevitably a chronicle of sites and artifacts, of animal bones and other archaeological data. Some people have remarked that it is written in stones and pottery, a dreary subject at best. But ultimately, prehistory, like history, is the story of people as individuals, as members of families and communities and groups. So, above all, this course is about people and how they behaved. The many societies described in these lectures had different and distinctive ways of explaining their world. This is what one might call the mirror of the intangible. The beliefs which shape society and its responses to every kind of challenge imaginable. Inevitably, these intangibles have vanished on the winds of history. Only occasionally can we get an insight into how people thought or their beliefs, because the chants and the dances have vanished. All that remains are the material surviving remains of these beliefs. And wherever possible in this course, I'm going to try and bring these beliefs to the forefront, be those of a Cro Magnon shaman or a Maya lord. This is, above all, a course about people. People surviving, flourishing, dying out, moving, responding to the constant challenges of an often hazardous world. And a chronicle of people dealing with one another with all the complexity and sophistication that we today deal with other nations. Please, from the very beginning, do not think that prehistory is simple. It was as complicated human existence in those days as it is today. We have more technology now, but what has not changed is the dynamics of people dealing with one another. And that is what prehistory ultimately is all about. In this introductory lecture, I've summarized the organization of the course. I've stressed that this is a narrative account of human prehistory from our origins over 2.5 million years ago in Africa, right up to the advent of literate civilization. I've stressed that the course summarizes 4 major developments in the human past: human origins, the spread of modern humans and archaic humans, the origins of food production, and the beginnings of civilization. The course follows a chronological organization, I stressed. And this means that in the first lecture, next lecture, I will talk about the very, very beginnings of human origins among the non-human primates.